Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ModGear. This week, I'm driving the Ford GT, a racing and automotive legend who beat Ferraris and did a lot of donuts. Let's just put it that way. So, let's get right into it, shall we? But before we begin this week's episode, let's take a step back in the past for a brief history lesson. Our story of the Ford GT begins, well, it's actually kind of tough to say, so I'll just start from the earliest bit. The actual name, GT, dates back to the 1960s, with the Ford GT40s. These cars were basically racing it out in a very, very famous race, as you may know, and that race is the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The GT40s were quite literally the Ferrari's rivals back on the track, because again, Ford versus Ferrari, and because back then in the 60s, Ford and Ferrari really just wanted to, hit each other in the 60s. Let's just put it that way. They wanted to hit on each other, not like, dating things, but they just wanted to slam at each other and, kill each other or something. And so, being that Ferrari had a solid win streak going, because, they were winning race after race after race, Ford decided it'd be a good idea to come in and say, I'm gonna just borrow this real quick, okay? The Ford GTs were quite literally monsters on the track, having lots of power, crazy top speed, and sounding just brutally amazing. Fast forward to around 3.5 to 4 decades later, and it's in the early 2000s. Ford decides that they want to make a new road-legal Ford GT, because let's face it, there wasn't really never necessarily a road-legal or street-legal version of the Ford GT40. And so, in 2002, a new concept car for the GT was revealed. Being very similar to the original GT40, because let's face it, there wasn't really a lot of a difference, this new GT car was basically the road version of that. Maybe, don't actually quote me on that. The car boasted a pretty sizably massive 5.4-liter V8, making 550 horsepower. So pretty relatively simple? Yeah, no. It's very relatively similar to the Jaguar F-Type that we reviewed last week, that also had a relatively similar sized engine, making similar power. So there's kind of a reference. For the time, the GT was, well, it was actually really, really fast. Being able to reach 205 miles per hour and to have a 0 to 60 time of 3.3 seconds. Let me remind you, this is a Ford. The second generation GT, which was revealed within the last couple years or so, was unveiled at the North American International Auto Show in 2015. The car was then created to help celebrate 50 years since the GT40s had actually won Le Mans in the first place, in 1966. The car itself was actually good looking, with very awesome, cool looking aerodynamics, yeah, I'm gonna get that right eventually. And all in all, butterfly doors, let's be honest. But that's not what made the GT so controversial when it was unveiled. No, the biggest thing that was different was the engine. The new Ford GT was powered by a 3.5-liter EcoBoost V6, making somewhere around 645 to 700 horsepower. And yet everyone still complained that, it was not a V8. Let's get to the point here. But we have to be honest here, Ford definitely put the EcoBoost V6 into the new Ford GT because they wanted to see how well and show people how well their EcoBoost engines actually were. And let's face it, it actually did pretty well, actually. But yet still, people still complain that there wasn't a V8 because, let's face it, sound. As of today, not many first generation Ford GTs are actually left, since there was only around 4,000 of them made, and at least about 300 of those were sent to other countries, and a lot of them are now probably in museums or in storage, stuff like that. It's very tough to say as to why most of those first generation Ford GTs are actually, in storage or museums, but let's face it, they're car collectors and they're collecting items, it kind of makes sense. And the second generation Ford GT is actually doing great in both the racing world and just overall sales, because let's face it, the car is actually selling very well, and as far as what Ford's doing by throwing it in races, it's winning pretty well, it's doing very, very well. I mean, heck, if you want to go learn more about the GT40s a little bit more in depth, since again, these history lessons aren't that great, go check out that new movie. I think it's called Ford vs. Ferrari, because, that's some good shiz right there. Let's just be honest here. But anyway, with that history lesson out of the way, we can get to this week's episode. Take it away, Panda. Thank you, Mr. History Panda. And with that, we can begin today's tests, starting with a top speed test. Welcome to the Genesis 1 mile dragway. It's a place where many cars come to push their engines, and well, a surprisingly large amount of their speed, to their limit, simply to put their speed onto the boards. So let's see how well the Ford GT can do in this test. The Ford, or GT, whichever one you want to call it, really doesn't matter, topped out at 136.2 miles per hour, but definitely with some further testing, topped out a little bit faster at 137.4. I can definitely feel that this car could keep accelerating, providing it had a longer runway, but we're just going to roll with what we have. So definitely a truly quick run from the GT. Next up is the stopping laughter of the brake test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to make sure that all 4 of the car's brakes stop once it passes this white line. The goal of the test is to not hit the parked Nissan Leaf, and if you do, you want to measure your speed based on how far the Nissan Leaf moved from its parking spot. So let's see how well the Ford GT can do in the brake test. The GT has very strong brakes, being able to come to a full stop before even touching the Nissan Leaf. So it's definitely a very excellent run from the Ford GT. Maybe that I wonder why it won Le Mans. Probably because of the good brakes, but let's be honest here, it probably did. Next up is the cornering test, and to do that, I've come here. This is the Forksville Test Circuit. Developed by the ModGear development team, it's used to help judge a car's endurance on tight corners, tight bends, and jumps, to further prove how a car does on a track-focused setting. So let's see how well the Ford GT can do. The Ford GT corners very well, surprisingly enough. It goes through corners at a solid pace, and body roll is still quite evident, let's face it, but it doesn't really do much to the car because, again, there's very little of it. The other thing I noticed was that it does tend to slide under heavy cornering, but letting off the gas, stuff like that, that's going to fix it pretty quickly. It's still a very good run from the 4GT. Next up is the reverse the roof of the parallel park test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to make sure that we can park the 4GT between these two parked Renault Meganes. And when we do, we want to make sure that there's enough space both in the front of the car and in the back of the car for someone to walk through. So let's see how well the 4GT can do. And with ease, the 4GT passes this test. Up next is your neighbor's front porch of the gravel road segment. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well cars can endure day-to-day driving conditions, whether this be potholes, bumps and roads, or just, road conditions. You're pretty sure you know what I mean. We want to see how well suspension travel works, all that good stuff. So let's see how well the 4GT does. The GT's ride is, well, it's actually pretty bad. There are some sparks coming off the back end pretty much all the time during the run. The suspension is basically just shooting itself through the body, so it's probably not a good thing. And the overall ride and just comfort just plainly sucks. It's a very unfortunate run from the 4GT, but I was honestly kind of expecting better considering it was doing very well, from beginning with. Next up is the bumps of the old roads on the bump test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well cars can endure on just, bumps. Large bumps, small bumps, that kind of thing. We want to see how well the undercarriage of cars can endure on these, as well as the front end and back end, to see if, if you're actually going to have to, turn into something, because, supercars, let's be honest. So let's see how well the 4GT can do in the bump test. Similar to the gravel road segment from the previous test, the 4GT doesn't really do well here at all. Again, sparks were very much present during this test in the back end, as well as the front end every once in a while. The suspension, once again, is just ramming itself into the body of the car, and the underside of the car is probably going to be destroyed in the process. It's a very unfortunate run from the 4GT. Next up is the nauseousness of the slalom test. The idea of this test is very simple. We want to see how body roll and a loss of cornering can affect a car on a track-focused setting. We already know how well the 4GT does and tackles these kind of things, but we're going to test this anyway to get a better idea. So let's see how well the car can do. The GT does pretty well here. My only really major complaints are three different things. For one, there is a very small amount of oversteer, but this can be easily fixed by just either letting off the gas or just, stop turning or maybe braking, but I don't want to judge that. Second, this car is surprisingly long and lengthy, so turning can be a bit challenging due to things like weight distribution and that kind of thing. And finally, 3. Body roll is still definitely evident, but it's very little, so it's not going to impact the car as much as something like massive body roll on things like, an RX-7 or something would. But still, it's a solid run from the Ford GT. The MPG figures the Ford GT has are not that great, with an average of 11 MPG in the city and 18 miles per gallon in the highway. They're not the greatest figures, especially for a car like this, especially, it's an EcoBoost engine, like Ford, what are you doing? But how do these figures apply on the track? And now, let's give the Ford GT an official lap around the Futaro circuit. The official standard time is 1:44:02. With added up accidents and collisions, the final adjusted time is 1:56:02.
Wheels are back on. Let's get this car back on the ground.
Sorry, Freeman.
All good to go.
What up, Fiat? The new.
Awesome race. Let's race again someday.
Okie dokie!
So, what are my final thoughts on the Ford GT? Well, to start, the car corners very well, has great top speed, and has some very good brakes. Let's face it, I wonder if that's how it won Le Mans. The ride isn't that great, and your gas bills are definitely going to add up very quickly because of, well, the MPG figures. I would suggest to buy this car, but surprisingly it's actually really expensive for, a V6, so you probably aren't going to get one. But even then, it's still an impressive car nonetheless. And I highly suggest you at least get to drive one of these things or sit in one, because again, it's actually quite shocking what a little V6 engine can do, especially with 700 horsepower. And on that grand touring-like note, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night.